Hi, I'm Meta Spencer, and today I get a real treat. I get to see an old friend, and we're going to get caught up, and you're going to really enjoy this too, because she is dynamite. Then I'm going to talk to my dear old friend, Dr. Samantha Nutt, who is a public health physician, and then some, a lot more than that. She, 20 years or so ago, because she'd worked in war zones a lot and has traveled the world and seen misery, she started something called Warchild Canada. I don't know, it was 20 years, I'm guessing she's going to straighten me out about the history of this thing. But at any rate, I haven't talked to her in a long time, so it's definitely time for us to get caught up. Good morning, Sam.
Good morning, Meta. And can I start by just saying happy birthday?
Oh, thank you.
I got the notice about your birthday, and I know it was an important birthday, an important milestone, and you're just amazing. So I'm so delighted to be here with you.
Well, I just love you. So we're now in sync.
It's mutual. The love is coming right back.
Yeah. Okay. Your work is so important and so unique, because I don't think there's anybody who's had any approach to peace building based on trying to reach children and put children in touch with other children, and globally. And it's such an intelligent thing to do, because kids surely care about and know and should know about each other, and people who don't realize how fortunate they are certainly can get a lesson from you.
Well, right. I think, from our perspective, and maybe I can update you on sort of where Warchild's been at for the last, now 20 years, and how much we've grown since we first sat down together, and even just since we last had a conversation. But, now we work with about 500,000 children and their families every single year. That's just Warchild Canada. And 99% of our staff are local. So they come from the communities that have been affected by war, and they are intimately involved in designing and implementing and following through on the programs. So they're either staff these are staff that we employ, but we also work a lot with local civil society organizations and investing in them and their capacity to be able to meaningfully engage in all kinds of efforts that really promote and sustain peace throughout the world. But our main areas of focus in terms of how we accomplish that have to do with education, access to justice. So we do a lot of work around the legal defense and upholding the rule of law as it pertains to women and children specifically, both under international law and within the national context. In fact, we're a registered law firm in a few of the countries in which we're operating, so that we can actively defend and uphold the rule of law for women and children. And then the third part is really around economic development and self-sufficiency for families to reduce the drivers of conflict. So as you know, and many of your listeners would as well, in many of the environments in which we're working, particularly in Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia, a lot of young people are drawn into militarized groups because of the lack of opportunity, because of the lack of education, the lack of employment, the other opportunities for them to earn an income, for their families to earn an income. And so providing opportunities for them to catch up with their school, get back into the appropriate grade level, or in the case of youth, specifically to be able to earn money outside of the military apparatus and provide for themselves and provide for their families is critically important. So those are our three areas of focus. 500,000 kids now, several hundred staff, more than 400 staff throughout the world, 99% of whom are all local, including at the country director level, which is quite unique.
I'm dazzled. I mean, I knew you were good, but I didn't know you were that good.
Well, I'm not, but I have 400 staff plus around the world who are just amazing, and investing. I like to think and hope that we were advocating for decolonizing aid long before it became part of public sensibilities around this. And that was our entire reason for existence, was to really break out of the old models of aid that were all short-term in terms of their focus. Food, water, shelter, blankets, all those things are important. But until we start to address some of these systemic inequalities and structural issues that exist, that fuel and feed war throughout the world and maintain war, then we're never actually going to really sustain peace. And that's why we exist.
Okay, so how do you manage this empire? If you've got 500,000 kids under your care, so to speak, you're doing things for them. Where are they, and how do you manage? I mean, just logistically, how many countries are you in?
Right now, we're actively in 7 different war-torn regions. So our biggest programs, I won't go through them all, they're on our website, which is warchild.ca, but our biggest programs right now would be Afghanistan, Eastern Congo, Uganda as well, where we work primarily in the north with refugees, specifically Southern Sudanese refugees. We're also in Sudan, South Sudan, and a few other locations. Yemen is a new area of operation for us. We still have some operations in Iraq, for example. So, but that gives you a flavor of where we are. And again, we work with national actors and with local civil society organizations. And then we have at our headquarters here in Toronto, we have about 25 full-time staff as well who support that work.
Oh, wow. Okay. No, I had no idea you'd grown so much. You're not, I don't want to say you're under the radar. I don't quite know what it is, but I don't see enough of you.
Well,
really, I don't. I mean, I think that your presence, you're doing such an important thing, and yet I don't think you get enough publicity. Is that possible, or what?
Well, I mean,
I'm just shocked that I didn't know all of that. That's what bothers me.
Well, maybe we need to do a better job of promoting that work then, and showcasing it a little bit more. I mean, the truth is that we as an organization don't pay for advertising. So we rely a lot on word of mouth. I do a lot of public speaking. I do, some writing, some media, that kind of thing. But we don't, we really do prioritize putting our money where our programs are. And for that reason, right, we have a really good, really low overhead ratio. So more than 90 cents on every dollar go directly to support our programs. And, so, I mean, you could certainly argue that if we perhaps invested more in advertising, that maybe our budgets would grow and our reach would grow. But for us, we've just been focusing on the work and showing that the work is effective and that it's sustainable and that it has the kind of impact that we are hoping it has. And it certainly does.
Okay, but I'm not suggesting that you ought to pay to have advertising, but I ought to be your advertiser. I mean, I have Peace Magazine and I have this talk show, and I need to be able to shout out to the world, hey, look at what Sam is doing.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
So you're largely in Africa, right? But also in Afghanistan.
Yep, and the Middle East. So we're still in Iraq. We have new operations that are in Yemen. And then we have been responding up until COVID, we were responding to the Syrian crisis. So we're still hoping to actually be able to begin implementation within Syria itself. We had applied for sort of approval to be able to operate within Syria. But because of delays related to COVID, the last 18, 19 months, that's been sort of suspended. But hopefully, once we have those approvals, then we'll be moving forward within Syria itself. We were in Jordan with Syrian refugees, but now a lot of those refugees, and we can discuss, what transpired there, but a lot of them were returned to Syria, and huge negative consequences for some of them. And so we had been hoping to move into Syria itself to be able to continue that work.
If you go into Syria, what will you do? For example, step by step, you will go to a certain place, you'll rent a house, you'll put up a sign. What will you do? And by the way, where do you get all the money for this?
Well, so we have a bunch of different donors, right? So we have institutional donors, government donors from throughout the world, including Global Affairs Canada and some others as well, including somebody from the US State Department, from the EU, and so on. We get money, about 30% as well, comes from foundations, multilateral organizations. We work a lot in partnership with the UN. So we're one of their subcontractors for a lot of various activities, particularly around kids and education. And then the other 30% we raise from the general public. And through various events that we do, we have a gala that's coming up in early December. Our last gala, which was virtual, this one will be virtual as well. We had Sting perform and some terrific Canadian talent. And that raised a couple $100,000 for us. Our annual budget every year is usually between 15 and 18 million. I'd love to see it hit more than 20 million. We could do a lot more with that, but we are making our dollars really stretch. So those are the fundamentals on our finances, at least.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I was sending you off to Syria, but let's not go to Syria yet. I want to look at how you work. Your interest is in music, and you put on a lot of concerts that would attract young people. And tell us about that. And is that still happening?
It is still happening. It's happening in different ways. So back when we started 20 years ago, our inaugural event actually was with the late great Gord Downey of the Tragically Hip, and that took place in Winnipeg during a huge international conference on war-affected children, and that was at the Forks. We had 80,000 people that showed up, and that was our official launch. And that raised, again, several $100,000 and got us up and running in terms of our field operations. Since then, we have definitely engaged with, we see a terrific bridge between not just music, but the arts and peace building and peace awareness. And that goes back, literally generations, right? So we've really tried to leverage that kind of peace activism through the arts, as both a fundraising vehicle and an advocacy vehicle for our organization. Over the years, because of, we're not here to discuss the future of the music business, but because of downloading, because the industry has changed quite a bit, and because artists rely so much on their live performance, we do still do some of that. We do a little bit less of that because we don't want to take away from the artist's capacity to also earn an income, right? So if they're performing for free at a Warchild event, then that reduces the income that they might be earning if they were running a concert, themselves, right? So we're very aware of that and the impact that's had on artists' financial health. So instead, what we do a lot more of now is that we have different ambassadors who are people who are really engaged in the issues, who talk about the issues, who promote the organization, who might fundraise for the organization using their various platforms. So we still do it. And again, we have our big virtual event that's happening in early December, which is free to attend if people want to participate in that. They just have to go to our website and sign up. And we'll be using that to fundraise and using the arts as a celebration and recognition of peace and peace activism.
You use the word gala. Is that what you're talking about? The next big performance, or kind of?
Correct. Yeah.
Tell me more what that would look like.
Yeah. So it's called Warchild at Home with the World, and people can sign up and log on. It's free to attend anywhere. And then we talk about what we do. We have various artists performing. It's like a variety show, but it comes in, it's going to be streamed through your computer. And our last one, like I said, raised several $100,000 for us. And we had terrific performers that participated. And I mentioned a few of them, Sting, Chantal Kerviazic. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And we'll have the same again this year. So if people are interested in learning more about what we do, listening to some great talent, seeing some outstanding performances, exclusive performances. And yes, we will definitely ask if you feel inclined to donate to support our programs. We'll be showcasing some of our programs throughout the world, but there's certainly no obligation or expectation. It's just for anyone who would like to participate. Last year, I think we had, I don't know, I can't remember what the final numbers were, but we had close to 100,000 downloads of people who watched the show, which was great.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, that clearly can't be as big a fundraiser as a live performance, though, because if you can't charge admission and you depend on donations, I don't think people are,
That's true. It isn't as good, but this, with the pandemic being what it is, we've all had to change and shift. I'm not going to use the word pivot actively in a sentence because I'm sick to death of the word pivot, just like I'm sick to death of the word lockdowns. But it's true that we've all had to figure out a path forward. But you did ask a really important question around how we get started in different areas of operation. So, if it's good for you, I can certainly address that now.
Okay. So you go, let's say, where would you go? To a city, or are you going to go, where would you pick to set up your base in, let's say, Syria, if you get a permission to go there?
Yeah. So the very first thing that we'll do is we obviously keep an eye on areas of both active conflict and then kind of simmering conflict where we think that there will be, increasing hostilities in the months and years ahead. And we also look at the humanitarian needs that exist. So, what are the threats? What is the situation for children? Where do we think that we might be able to make an impact? Who's on the ground there? So we do a lot of that advanced information gathering even before we would decide to operate in a particular location. And then once we have demonstrated, so Yemen's a good example, that there is obviously a growing and urgent need. And in that case, in the case of Yemen and Syria, very few international humanitarian actors that are able to operate in that space for a number of different reasons. If we identify that that's a place where we should be, then we will start with consultations. So usually we will start in the major urban centers. We will meet with different civil society organizations, different community leaders as a huge priority, different UN agencies, other humanitarian organizations within the space, because we don't want to duplicate the good work that others are doing, but we want to be able to enhance it and complement it. So that's where we will start. And then again, our expertise, because we are the only organization actually that's uniquely focused on the impact of war on children. So we're the only organization in the world that is our specialization. So once we get in there, we will then talk to those different parties and stakeholders, including sometimes national governments, if there are national governments, if there's like a Ministry of Education or, those kinds of things around what we do and how we do it. So specifically, one of the things we're internationally recognized for is our catch-up learning programs. So in places like the Eastern Congo, in Northern Uganda, even in Afghanistan, where kids, because of displacement, because of violence, and now because of the pandemic, their education has been disrupted in some cases for many years, that becomes a barrier to education for those kids. And that has a negative, not only lifelong impact, but also has a negative mental health impact, right? Because school is a safe, protective environment for children in most instances. So understanding, how we can get kids back into school, what infrastructure exists, that's one of the things that we do. And we run these catch-up learning programs tied to the local education system that allow kids to catch up 2 years over less than 1 year. So if you've got 17-year-olds in Eastern Congo who were, for example, fighting with the Mai Mai militia, who've then been demobilized and sent back to communities, and there are no programs for them. These are kids who've been out of school for 7, 8, 9 years. They're often functionally illiterate. They don't want to go back to being in grade 1. And so that will predispose them to then joining other roving militia groups, forming their own criminal gangs. So identifying those kids, having a path for them to catch up on their learning, get back into the appropriate grade level, and actually graduate, finish their education. That's one of the things that we specialize in and that we're recognized for throughout the world. And we've had tremendous success rates, both in terms of, Southern Sudanese refugees, Congolese kids. We also specialize in what's called distance-based learning, so remote learning. So in places where kids, where there is no functioning school for them because of violence or because of insecurity, whether it's because they're like in Eastern Congo, where the risk of sexual violence is so high, people are holding girls back from school because they don't, feel that it's safe for them to make the journey. Then what we do is we use in those contexts the basic technology of radio, for example, in Eastern Congo. And we have Congolese educators who have recorded lessons that are tied to the curriculum, including some Congolese celebrities. And then we patch it into the local communities. People bring the kids together. We have teaching assistants that go out. So we use very basic, easily accessible technology to help those kids catch up. And even based on our own studies, we found that the children who participate in those programs usually exceed the sort of national average in terms of their success rates on the final exam. So we're creating ways for kids to catch up and get back into school. So for Syria, we'll have those conversations around, what are the gaps? Kids have been displaced, kids have missed out on school, the schools have been destroyed, the teachers have been lost. Is there an opportunity for us to offer catch-up learning, distance-based learning, other kinds of opportunities for kids? And then, so that would be the first step. Then the second step would be to get out into those communities to then conduct those community-based evaluations to be, very forward facing in those interactions, to meet with families, to meet with kids, to meet with educators, because particularly the urban areas tend to be the rural areas tend to be the ones that have the greatest gaps and the greatest needs, right? Mm-hmm. So that would be the initial phase, the consultation phase. And then we would just, we would start and we would identify our national civil society partners, recruit national staff, participate in a period of training and sort of mentorship and capacity building, and then we're off and running. So
I'm impressed that you would be able to do so much with radio.
Yes,
because I hear that people all over the world in the darkest jungles have cell phones. I don't know. I haven't been to the darkest jungles, but if you could use videos, I would think that you could do a lot more, because you could show people how to, how the letters are formed and whatever. Is that the case, or do you feel you do just fine, thank you, with radio?
Well, sometimes you do have access to online, but a lot of the areas in which we're operating, families simply don't have that access to the technology, or there are too many disruptions too in terms of the electrical supply. So it makes it a little bit tricky. So, you can, in some environments, we have used cell phone and other technologies, not exactly in the way that you've described, but more in terms of reporting of abuses that children experience. And so they can actually call one of our support lines or even text it and report some of the things that they've been experiencing. But in terms of the education piece, the nice thing about radio, and it's not that we just pipe it into the village and say, oh, come and listen to this, you'll learn something. We actually train local teaching assistants, so they don't have to be certified teachers, and other staff who then go into the community, who use the kind of radio broadcast as the guide, but then who can then work with the kids. You actually have to provide a supportive framework in the form of personnel to be able to then, help them through that period. It's just not as labor intensive, though. You don't have to have a full-time teacher, and it doesn't have to be every day to enable those kids to then catch up. And remember, look, in-person learning is still the best. We know this. Everyday learning consistency is still the best. But in the absence of having that, what you don't want is nothing. And then for those kids to fall further and further behind. So we're very much that kind of backfill, that stopgap in the case where there's just too much violence, too much instability, too many gaps in the education system, that you then have to find alternatives in terms of how you will address those. And we're the alternative.
To what extent are you innovating these techniques yourself? I mean, I'm just wondering if you've got a really well-developed, reliable program. This sounds like the sort of thing that every government should be able to put together and do. And maybe other government educators and so on should be able to learn from you. Or is this your own system? How did you come up with this? I've not heard of people using radio for in education before.
It's actually a Canadian innovation. So it started in I think it was like the 30s and 40s, mostly in farm areas in Ontario and Saskatchewan, where kids weren't able to go to school. And so broadcasters were using radio to actually pipe in lessons for kids in those like harder to reach areas, and found that was quite successful. And actually those were sort of the beginning years of public education broadcasting, right? So it's interesting that, you can look at the role the CBC played and other broadcasters played, TVO, in providing education to kids using radio. So in a way, we didn't invent it, but we certainly looked at different models that existed. And one of our great frustrations, I think, over the last few years is that, there's this real push to use technology and to innovate to provide solutions to really complex problems, right? And we all know that an app is not going to solve poverty. And we all know that, a tablet is not going to, in and of itself, particularly in environments where, kids don't even have access to lessons plans that are in their native language, are going to enable them to graduate and go on to university. I mean, it's just sort of this situation is much more complex than that. So, our situation was always, well, what exists that we can then build upon, as opposed to forcing these new technologies that also become very hard to sustain. If you give out tablets, kids drop tablets. I mean, kids break them, things get resold in markets. I mean, this is what happens. But what exists locally? Well, radio exists locally. So why would you not rely on what exists and build that up? And in terms of working with national governments, I mean, absolutely. In fact, right now, the Ministry of Education in Uganda is running a huge pilot program with us using, again, our catch-up learning programs and some of our distance-based learning programs through COVID to be able to reach kids that are in some of the more impoverished areas and some of the areas where schools have not been able to sustain their educational platforms. We're doing it in Eastern Congo. We're working with the Ministry of Education, who just actually called our staff there this morning to say that the preliminary results are very, very encouraging from the larger rollout during COVID using this technology again. So we're still waiting on the final results. But
where again? Sorry, where?
Eastern Congo. So, again, we're not, unlike a lot of, and this is not a criticism, but unlike a lot of humanitarian aid organizations that often go into an area and exist outside of the system of government and national civil society organizations and are more reliant on an expatriate infrastructure, that's not our model. Our model was always to build up what exists, to invest in the competencies and capabilities of national organizations, national partners, national sort of leadership, and make that work possible. And so for us to set up something like this that isn't aligned with the Ministry of Education's priorities, I mean, that we would never do that. We always make sure that that we're certainly doing things that are sustainable and responsible and in the interests of and desired by the broader community.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now you go into places that are either currently in violence, conflict, or recently. And I'm just wondering, how do you do that? It sounds like a very, very tricky business going into a war zone. Do you always try to get the approval and permission of the whatever claims to be the ruling government? And if so, then how do you contact the people who are the insurgents if you want to reach them too? Do you try to accommodate both sides, or sometimes there are 3 or 4 or 5 sides in a war? Do you try to reach out to all of the people who are affected? And if so, isn't that dangerous?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the answer to the question of how do you go into a war zone, the only answer is very carefully. It's
like how porcupines make love.
That's right. Yeah. It's the same kind of thing. Look, sometimes it takes time, right? It takes time to build trust, to build networks. And, Yemen is a very good example. We are now approved to operate on multiple sides of that conflict. We're dealing with multiple jurisdictions in terms of who controls various areas. And while that isn't a guarantee of your safety, I know that not getting those approvals and permissions means that you are certainly going to be a target. And so you do need to spend the time and the resources to, again, have those conversations to make sure that you have the permissions and the approvals. And if you don't get them, then it may not be feasible to operate in that particular environment. The one thing that we find, though, is that when you're dealing, again, when you emphasize and prioritize working with national organizations, national actors, national civil society groups, they're your lead. They're your barometer all the time, right? So they advise and consult and tell us what is feasible, what is practical, and what from a safety point of view, what what is reasonable and what is secure, right? So, Afghanistan's another good example. We've been in 9 different districts of Afghanistan, 9 different areas within Afghanistan. The vast majority of those, even before the fall of the government in August, the vast majority of those were already under some degree of de facto Taliban control, and yet we were still able to operate in Kandahar, and elsewhere. And that was because we have strong networks, because we were engaging with the mullahs, because we were engaging with the local political authorities and leadership, so that they understood what we were doing. We would take the time to explain it. We would ensure that we had cooperation and buy-in. When, I think a mistake that many groups make is to sort of go in with a very prescriptive agenda, and then to force that agenda, and to not really listen and not do the due diligence, and not make sure that you have got the cooperation and support of the local communities. That to us is absolutely paramount. And again, because we have such strong local representation and local networks, it means that we're often able to work in areas where others can't or won't. That means we're able to get into a lot of areas where others can't or won't, including more recently with the Ethiopian crisis in Tigray. As many thousands of refugees were coming across the border into Sudan, it was our team from Darfur, all Darfurian, that redeployed to be able to respond to that crisis, because kids were arriving, and I'm sure you've read some of the stories, absolutely traumatized, and families had gone through horrific violence and horrific abuse. And it was our Darfurian team that mobilized and responded, in that situation. While they were there, unfortunately, Darfur also imploded, and many of them lost their homes in the process, and had no homes to get back to. And so we were dealing with all of that. But there is an example again of it's that it's the local nature of our work that I think enhances certainly our capacity, our responsiveness, and our access.
You make it sound obvious and simple, and why hasn't everybody done it that way? I mean, seriously, I'm wondering. My impression is that almost everybody, every Western outfit or Western-oriented based outfit in let's say in Afghanistan would be in very much at risk right now, and uncertain about what the rules of the game are going to be, and so on. Are you unique in this, or are there lots of NGOs or INGOs that are functioning the way you do by trying to get all sides on your team, or get cooperation before you commit too much?
I mean, I think that a lot of organizations who are invested in the development side of peace, as opposed to the emergency side of humanitarian operation, I think that they function in very similar ways. And I know that we're not alone in Afghanistan. I mean, obviously, with the Taliban, there's a new reality in Afghanistan, and certainly, I don't want to sort of understate. I mean, obviously, there are concerns for the safety and security of our staff. Absolutely. We're still waiting for some direction, particularly from the new government, around what organizations, including our own, will be allowed to do. How will we operate? Will we be allowed to operate in the same way? Will we be allowed to? We have a number of our staff are female employees, and we need to be able to continue to employ them to do our work, especially the forward-facing work with women in rural areas. I mean, you can't have men doing that, right? So, like a lot of organizations, we're waiting for that kind of resolution. We are concerned about the safety of our staff, but we also are hearing from our staff that they want to continue the work. And our job is to support them in that endeavor when that moment is possible. So are we unique? I mean, I think there are aspects to our work that make us certainly unique and very, very specialized. We work a lot in conjunction with other like-minded international organizations. We have consortium type projects where it's not just us, but it might be us with World Vision, with Oxfam, with other groups that are delivering those services. We're specialized in a particular piece of it, so we focus on that. They focus on other bits. But as to should everyone be doing it this way? I mean, look, I think that I think that we need to really think critically about international humanitarian aid, the good that it can do, the negative that it has done. We have certainly seen and heard reports of different international organizations being involved in, misappropriation of funds, in some cases, accusations of sexual violence, including UN agencies and others in recent weeks and months. And so I think that we need to all be accountable here, and we need to ask really important questions around whose interests are being best served. And for me, it always comes back to, if we really believe in the importance of peace, we need to rethink our strategies and our approaches. And the focus has to be on local models, local leadership, local engagement, and making those consistent investments to allow those champions of peace, of women's rights, of the rights of children, to thrive, to grow, to lead, to prosper. And when we're doing that, I think that's when we're most successful.
Okay, but now we're talking about transition in Taliban, the new Taliban government, but you were already there. How long have you been functioning, and where do you work in Afghanistan now? And what I'm wondering is, what were the rules of the game until the Taliban government took over? Were your teachers, for example, wearing burqas? I mean, I'm trying to think of what to me would be an absurd example, but maybe reality. I don't know.
It depends on the local context. I mean, that's a legitimate question. So we've been there now for almost 20 years. Certainly the last few years, particularly in the rural areas, the Taliban had been gaining strength. We had seen a strong conservatism in some of those rural areas, including in Kandahar. And again, you have to, it's really important that you bring people into the conversation, that you sort of nurture, that you encourage, that you listen, that you rely on those local community groups who have tremendous legitimacy to have some of those conversations around the rights of women, to frame it in terms of the rights of women within Islam, so that some of those conservative groups who say, well, this isn't an Islamic practice, you need your local mullahs, your local religious clerics, your local women's rights champions to say, well, actually, yes, it is. And here's what the Quran has to say about the rights of women. So, again, you have to come at this from the perspective of investing in what exists, as opposed to coming in with a full Western agenda that is very finger wagging, that says, well, this is how you need to do it. Because if you're trying to get local communities where you're already struggling to maintain the rights of women from a situation of say, no rights to 100. I mean, Canada's not at 100 yet either, but we can have, that's a whole other conversation. You're not going to get that. And you're certainly not going to get that within a generation. I mean, you're probably not going to get that within my lifetime in those environments. But if you can incrementally build on what exists, it's amazing how what that trajectory then looks like at the end of that time. We found through our programs, for example, that 5 years later, the women that we were working with their children, very few of those children were in school. They go through our literacy and numeracy program, our skills training program. Their children are enrolled in catch-up learning and childcare efforts, early childhood education, while they're participating in our program. Even 5 years after they've left, we still have close to 100% of those kids in school, whereas before we would have had fewer than half of those kids in school. So again, you have to measure success in different ways, right? I mean, and a lot of the times it's those initial steps that demonstrate that you're on the path to success. It's not because people are running frantically to get to the finish line.
You personally, what do you do? Do you go out to some of these places occasionally? Do you travel?
I sure do. Yeah, I usually am overseas. COVID notwithstanding, we haven't been able to travel during COVID, but usually anywhere from sort of 3 to 4 times a year, mostly to check on programs, look at expanding programs, look at potentially security issues, that kind of thing. But, for example, prior to COVID, I think I was in Iraq at least 2 to 3 times a year for the sort of couple of years before that, especially with the rise of ISIS and looking at sort of our programming there and what we were going to do. But right now, not as much. Hopefully, starting in 2022, I'll be traveling again. But we have such strong, local staff, local networks. Our country directors are all local or from the region. So our programs have maintained, in fact, they've expanded during COVID. We've also added a lot of public health prevention work to our activities so that our community groups are educated on how to stay safe and wearing masks and proper sanitation and that sort of thing.
How do you find the people that you want to recruit as your staff in these local areas? If they're all local people, you won't know them. How do you find the right folks?
Time, patience, asking a lot of questions. We get recommendations as well from other organizations that are working. We interview, we post, we recruit. I mean, all the usual sorts of ways that you find staff. And then once you have your most senior staff, your country director and your sort of senior management team, then they recruit for the other positions and get recommendations from the communities. But you also have to be careful too, right? Like you want to make sure, especially in environments where there's a lot of ethnic tensions and that sort of thing, differences between groups, you have to make sure you have equal representation and that you're not, whether through sort of willfully or through, just a lack of awareness, propping up one group at the expense of the other, and that because that can send a particular message.
Tell me where you found easy and what countries you found hard.
They're all hard, Meta. It's all hard. So I don't know. There are the countries that I've been ambushed in. There are the countries that I've been, where war has broken out and we've had to flee, be evacuated. I still think one of the hardest was certainly for me Somalia during the famine. That was right when I started in doing this kind of work. Just the sheer lawlessness, the insecurity, the instability, the fact that at the time I was working for the UN, you really couldn't even travel to do the work without having armed technicals who were effectively, young men in their late teens with Kalashnikov rifles who were sitting in the back of the car, who were supposed to be protecting the humanitarian workers. To me, that contradiction was just.
Let me explore that, because I actually have tried to set up a talk show on that very issue, and I haven't found the right discussants. For various reasons, people decline. But I remember a time, it must have been 30 years ago, down at Harborfront, there was a very interesting confrontation between General Mackenzie, who had been in Sarajevo, and James Orbinski, who's I know a friend of yours. And the interesting conversation was about the protection of humanitarian workers, I believe, in Sarajevo. Mackenzie had been put there with peacekeepers with the idea that he had to find a role for himself, and there wasn't any predetermined opportunity for him. So he defined his own mandate as being one of protecting humanitarian workers as they moved around the city, offering medical aid and so on. And James Orbinski said, "Get away from us, leave us alone. You're making us more danger, putting us in more danger than if we were on our own." That and I've heard later other comments about how many military operations want to disguise themselves as partly humanitarian, and so they will have soldiers run up on the front door with of a house and deliver some groceries, and ring the bell and go, and to give a good impression of themselves as being humanitarian workers rather than military. And the objection was that this contaminates the work of real humanitarian workers because they get identified, and the notion was that if you have military people accompanying or trying to be identified with the humanitarian workers, that it's harmful to everybody. And I want to have a conversation about that in greater detail, but I haven't found the right people. Tell me what you think about it, and maybe where I should go to look for other people who have more recent experiences along those lines.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wholeheartedly agree with James Robinsky on that front. In fact, I had a whole chapter in my book on the problems that occur when you blur the lines between military and humanitarian, military goals and military strategy and humanitarian aid, and the whole problems of the problem of the kind of hearts and minds strategy. And I get into, I don't know, did I send you this? I think, did I ever?
I'm so glad you have it there. I was going to ask you, hold it up right.
But I should send it to you. I'll make sure. Oh,
hold it up some more. All the way. Damned Nations. Yeah, I love that title. Just wonderful. Okay.
I didn't mean to have a shameless book plug, but I just actually looked over. I was like, there is my book right there on the desk.
Yeah, sure.
Because I was looking something up for somebody wanted to quote. But no, I mean, the reality is that this blurring of the lines, which, you can go back to, yeah, I mean, the whole hearts and minds strategy, I think, started in the 40s and 50s. But, if you look at Somalia under Operation Restore Hope, where you had a militarized intervention that was ostensibly to deliver food, but then also sort of had mission creep around getting rid of ID'd at that time, which, absolutely degraded relationships between international humanitarian organizations and local communities and local government, and made them a target. I mean, there's no disputing that happened. And so when you look at the extent to which aid organizations were and still are being targeted in Somalia and are seen as
back up. Tell me more about what was so degraded. I don't get it. Right.
So when you've got armed soldiers who are landing with, ostensibly under humanitarian mandate. Mm-hmm. The problem is that the business of sort of the military goals and objectives, the business of taking lives in that context, right? The defending state interests and sort of the broader Western agenda there, and the business of saving lives, which is supposed to exist in this politically neutral, safe humanitarian corridor, that those two agendas become inextricably, they just become confused, right? Mm-hmm. And so then all of a sudden, everyone who's engaged in food relief, humanitarian operations, when you've got soldiers that are doing that work, and then you've got aid workers that are doing that work, then all of a sudden those lines have been blurred. And for a lot of certainly local militants and local community groups, there is no distinction. And then when you build on that, so in Afghanistan, where you actively had armed forces that were involved in humanitarian operations, so the thinking is when you see our soldiers out there and they're building schools and they're building hospitals and they're providing these kinds of services, that's a good thing for the soldiers, and it's also good in terms of winning community support. But what it does inevitably is it also suggests that when other people are out there, they're supposed to be neutral humanitarian actors who are unarmed humanitarian actors, and they're engaged in those same activities. What's the distinction, right? You're all part of a broader geopolitical agenda. Mm-hmm. that in the minds of a lot of local communities, that distinction is lost, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. And it puts aid workers increasingly at risk. And even if you look, and this is where, again, James is right, if you look at the trends in terms of the numbers of aid workers who are now being specifically targeted or killed in the line of duty over the last 20 years with starting with Somalia, then you had Kosovo, you have Afghanistan, you have Iraq as well. those numbers have just ballooned, and you can really draw a direct line, and that's what I get into in my book, which is why you can really draw a direct line between that shift in policy and militarized engagement in humanitarian activities, and the increased targeting of aid workers, and the complete disintegration of what used to be the humanitarian space.
I think the most egregious example that occurs to me was when they were trying to scout around in Pakistan to find Osama bin Laden, and they sent out teams of people ostensibly to provide vaccinations for the children, house to house. They were going door to door, and saying that they were providing medical help, and then that really turned people against the idea of even getting vaccinations. Because these people were lying. They were really military people looking for bin Laden.
Well, and that's one of the complications, right? And the other sort of more recent example of that too was the flagrant violation of international law that took place in Syria, where you had the bombing of MSF, Doctors Without Borders hospitals, and specifically being targeted and attacked by. At that moment, it was Assad's forces, and then they were using the cover that, there were militants that we thought were firing at us from around the corner, but they decimated those hospitals and claimed it was a huge loss of life, and many casualties for MSF during those couple of years. And that's a flagrant violation of international law. When you start to see humanitarian organizations as a part of a broader military apparatus, then you have a real problem. You're not just putting the lives of those aid workers at risk. You're also risking the lives of all of those who depend on those services.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, okay. So where are you going next? What do you see for the future of Warchild Canada, or Warchild in the world in general?
Well, we've got some new operations we're trying to expand in Yemen, which I've mentioned already. And we've got a couple of others because of so many refugees arriving in Pakistan as well. We were in Pakistan previously. We're trying to augment our refugee response in Pakistan as a result of Afghanistan. So that's a priority for us. Figuring out the path forward in Afghanistan as well, huge ongoing priority for our organization. We're also expanding into Latin America and looking at armed conflict there. A lot of that is gang-based, and so we're looking at El Salvador and a few other locations as well, particularly with the migrant and refugee crisis that is happening at the borders with the United States. And so looking to see how it is that we might have a role in protecting and supporting children who are facing armed violence in those circumstances. COVID has certainly, I would say, dampened some of those ambitions, in that we still need to be able to do, and we talked about this at the front end, that initial setup, those initial consultations, to build our networks and build the local capacity that is there. Hopefully we'll be able to do that in 2022. In the interim, we're just continuing on and responding to the humanitarian needs as they emerge, investing in our programs, fundraising, all the usual stuff.
What would you do with respect to this southern border of the U.S. issue? By the way, I did the current issue of Peace Magazine has your old friend Lloyd Axworthy on the cover, because I did a very long conversation with him, which I transcribed and put in the magazine, about refugees, because of course now he's the head of this World Refugee and Migration Council. Mm-hmm. And he had an idea that I wonder why it's not being adopted everywhere, which was that instead of having all of these migrants move to the southern border of the U.S. and sit there making life difficult for Biden, for example, why don't they set up application offices in all of these countries, as Canada does? I mean, when I became an immigrant to Canada, an official green card or whatever I was, I had to go to France for the summer and apply outside the country in order to come in, rather than just go to the border and hang around. And so his idea is that, Canada has offices all over the place where people apply in their own country to come, and they could be processed, and the information about them could be collected much more easily in their own country, because they do need to provide documents and things like that. So it'd be more convenient for everybody, and it would take all of this terrible pressure off the current U.S. government, which seems unable to change the rules about immigration. Why? I thought that was smart. Why didn't everybody do that already? Do you know anything about that? Has anybody proposed that, and why isn't it happening?
I don't know, but I have great respect for Lord Axworthy, and I think that certainly sounds reasonable to me. And I agree, it is a major flaw in the system that people can't be processed locally. But the other thing I would say too is that we need to also take a long, hard look at what is driving this mass displacement. And in many instances, it is violence. It is arms, right? It is fear, and it is a lack of opportunity. So there are ways that we can intercede as a global society in every single one of those areas that create that kind of vulnerability, right? We didn't even get into in this conversation yet. Maybe I'll have to come back. I'll have to be a frequent flyer on your show, but we didn't even get into the arms trade, right? And the sale of small arms and the rabid profiteering, particularly among wealthy nations, when it comes to the sale and the transfer of small arms in the world, not just small arms, but other military hardware. We know Canada has been embroiled in that $15 billion arms deal to Saudi Arabia. We know that we are among the top 20 small arms exporters in the world. We know that a lot of the violence that Warchild's confronting throughout the world is, groups that are armed with principally small arms, right? They're not driving many of them around in tanks. They're using small arms, so RPGs, machine guns, AK-47s, that kind of thing. So, we need to, I think, understand how it is that we can have, I think, a more robust response to preventing violence, to upholding and protecting civilians who are living within those environments, to ensuring that they have access to income, that they have access to education, because in many cases it's hopelessness and despair that is driving people to make these extremely, I think, life-threatening choices to put their children and themselves into a rubber boat and to try to get across the Mediterranean to find refuge in Europe, or in the case of the United States, that they're trying to get across into Texas and confronting increased danger in that process. So I don't know, I think that's a practical solution. I'm in favor of that, but I also think that we need to really reconsider what we prioritize on a global level, and whose lives we prioritize, and the great inequities and injustices that exist within that context. That's what we have.
Okay, you've just offered, and I hereby accept your offer to have another show about that very topic. And I got some other people in mind, people through Project Plowshares.
Yes, I love them.
Yeah,
I love them. They're great.
So I will get back to you on that, because it's not a new idea by any means. It's something I've worked on, trying to follow up with all the other conversations I've had with about that in various ways, but to have a sustained discussion of Canada's role in providing military hardware for groups that shouldn't have it. Yeah.
Well, and weapons are a public health menace, and we don't talk about it in public health terms, right? So we have all these injunctions around COVID-19 as a public health threat to our global society. Why are small arms not being treated in the same way? Obviously the two situations are not completely analogous, but as a public health threat, small arms in particular are claiming thousands and thousands of lives, and we need to take it seriously.
Okay, this has been just exactly what I expected: stimulating, exciting, even fun, and it's wonderful to see you again. So we will be back in touch, and I thank you very, very much, and share my love with your family.
I will, Meta, and it's so good to see you, and happy birthday again. I know Eric also, my husband Eric says happy birthday too.
Bye-bye, dear.
Bye, Meta.